When it comes to two good friends getting ready to face off each other, the only thing you can do is hope that they bring peace. You can hope that they can talk it out. You can hope that things don't go completely to crap. You can also sweeten the deal. That's what humans did. Every single one of them within the Nishani or the forced areas immediately withdrew themselves, their families, their ships, all their technology. This caused both fleets inside the contested zone to pause for a total of 31 hours. 31 hours while both sides continued to talk back and forth with each other. 31 hours they stood there with weapons aimed at each other, not charged, but silent. 31 hours of peace. Then the shooting started. The shooting started as a volley came from both sides. They both realized that each side was starting to charge up their weapon systems. No one really knows, as it was a tight stream communications, what caused them both to get all pissed off, but apparently this was the starting point. From there, reinforcements were called, but it would take them a while to warp their way in. They, of course, needed to use jump gates and relays and things of that nature. Humans were the only ones who could jump in without needing such devices. Though this wouldn't matter much. Both fleets were already set up perfectly in their own formations when everything kicked off. When it did, the sky lit ablaze with all sorts of energy weapons, projectiles, missiles, torpedoes, drones filled the skies, different fighter craft, everyone who had a main gun, secondary or tertiary weapon began to fire. Even the point defense weapons fired randomly into the enemy fleets. This was not actually to hit anything, at least not in between, as they were outside of the effective range, but simply adding their own kinetic energy to the shots that were coming in. Maybe they would get lucky and strike something vital. But neither side seemed to be pulling any punches. The forced, with their aggressiveness, immediately started to push forward. They immediately closed with and began to duck and dive their ships as much as they could. Their main flagships weren't exactly the most mobile things in the world, but their smaller ships were nimble enough that they could get inside the Nishani fleets and began to wreak all sorts of havoc. The problem they had is that the Nishani were no slouches. They outnumbered the force 3-1. This meant they were evenly matched as far as tactical prowess, at least in ships. And of course, once everything started, nobody wanted to withdraw. You never want to face your stern towards the enemy, as that's always where the least amount of weapons are. Yet both fleets seemed to entangle themselves as they tore each other to pieces, some of them being desperate enough to crash into each other. Some of the four ships even adopting Nishani tactics, which were more defensive and nimble. This caused a lot of impacts to happen. In some cases, even friendly fire, which is never friendly, began to tear at each other. Both fleets would continue to rip at each other as nobody ever wanted to back up. No one wanted to lose any space in between them. Eventually, as the reinforcements began to show up, they tried to drive towards the front lines, but as the front line began to dissipate, the reinforcements were hesitant to go in and start wasting more and more of their vessels, more and more of their people. They began to wait, and eventually the lines separated over time, as the reinforcements were only sending in recovery ships trying to get their own people out. The recovery ships were never fired upon, if it all helped. This was due to the fact that they knew the way humans were. If they found out that recovery ships, i.e., dock, was fired upon, the humans would come in with such reckless abandonment that they would not want to be on the receiving end. So they simply allowed them to get their wounded and get the rest out. However, they were not allowed to grab any of the damaged or disabled ships, just the personnel, which suited both sides just fine. In the darkness of space, many hulks of ships that were once proud military vessels now simply clanged against each other, some of them still stuck together as they ran into each other, and the metal merged with each other. And now they just floated there. Midway through this system, as many of the reinforcements reconsolidated, reformed, and got ready for the next charge. Obviously, The wives of Larry and Vince were pretty much inconsolable at this point. The reports were coming in, and they were completely afraid that they were going to be losing entire families, entire bloodlines, entire generations, maybe, of their own people. And they were scared. They were horrified at this idea. The kids were caught watching the reports and the videos of what was happening. Many of them had to turn away. Others sat there and listened, horrified themselves, but completely intrigued, as children are naturally inquisitive, of course. The husbands tried desperately to calm everyone down. Their wives would cry on them at least once a day, worried that they would not ever see their families again, outside of their immediate family, of course. With this, they went and helped out the kids when they asked, "Daddy, why are they doing that?" With that, the men brought the kids together. They didn't want to answer the same question 7 or 8 times, so they simply brought them together to let them know, "Well, kids, you see, they're after the resources. Most of you understand that. Those gas giants and their moons are extremely valuable. And because it's, well, what they consider free real estate, they just want to take it. The problem is it's not free. It's obviously going to be paid in foreign blood. Along with that, there's the financial. Yeah, that goes in with the resources. They just want to be able to sell all that stuff, so make them stronger as far as everyone's concerned. Along with that, you got the military portion. That's going to be allowing them to make themselves even stronger compared to everyone else. Be able to intimidate just by just being there. Isn't that what we do? A little bit. However, we don't try to intimidate. We've already learned that throughout our history. You all have learned human history, I'm sure. With that, the kids kind of looked at each other, most of them nodding. However, the youngest ones were a little confused as they hadn't got their lessons up to par yet. On top of that, you got to understand, there's also the territory itself. Yeah, wars have been fought for generations over territory. Just a little strip of land can be something you'll spend hundreds of thousands of bodies over. It's horrible. It's terrible. Been there, done that. Yeah, we both got the t-shirt, I know. There's also one other factor, the X factor. What's that? It's ego, dominance over others. You want to be perceived as the strongest one, the biggest one there. Oh, you mean like Uncle Vince is compared to you? He's a lot bigger than you are. Vince started laughing. Well, at least in the shoulders, yeah. Looking up and down. Sneaky little. With that, they continued to go over the questions, and most of the kids could understand it, but it was a little more difficult to wrap the brains of the youngest ones around the whole thing. They didn't understand. Can't we all just get along? When one of the kids said that, both of the men started laughing in hysterics. But the kids didn't understand this. They were simply told, and I quote, "Don't worry, inside joke, kids, inside joke." As the first verified reports began to roll in, it was noted with the first confrontation over 280,000 personnel confirmed dead, times 3 wounded. It was a horrific idea. It would have been even worse if it wasn't for the fact that they had listened to the humans and let them actually go in and get their wounded and not just left them in the ether of space to suffocate, starve, or die of dehydration, all of which are bad ways to go. Every time they brought this up, one of the older children would always say, "There's 1,000 ways to die in space, and they all suck." With that, the men realized that their lessons had definitely taken root. Tensions were high all around, though. It wasn't just in the household, it was throughout the entire system, throughout the entire universe itself. These were two of the strongest out there. They had already been able to hold themselves up against an invasion, and they had been able to build their fleets up afterwards. Though they had assistance in this, it was still terrifying to see the two biggest guys on the block duking it out. Fleets from other species were beginning to put on standby, which of course raised tensions. The rear defense fleets of those were definitely active, most of which were perimeter guard around their own homeworlds, as that was the key to any invasion. If they were able to hit the homeworld, they would either be able to trick the other force into charging in prematurely, or force them to surrender, as they didn't want to lose the sparkling jewel that everyone called their homeworld. It was just the way it is. Though for most, it wasn't the homeworlds they were worried about. Usually it was colony worlds that were within a sector or two of the front line itself. They did not want to be anywhere around. The actual combative species were definitely evacuating all their colonies nearby, as these made very easy targets of opportunity. Nobody wanted to see thousands, tens of thousands of their own people taken out just out of a sheer orbital bombardment. However, it wasn't just the combative species. It was also the non-aggressive species who decided to remove their own people from the colonies, however, would station patrol ships around to let them know if the aggressive species were going to go into their territory. The other species were worried, very worried. They didn't want this war to escalate and go into their territory. They defended their borders. They made sure that commerce was allowed to continue, of course. However, no military ships of any sort were allowed to come through their territories. This was a recommendation that humanity had even brought up. Vince himself had actually told all the other species that this was probably their best bet to make sure the war did not expand. This, of course, pissed off the Forced and the Shawnee, as they wanted a way to get around the front lines, as the front line was a very narrow corridor as it was. Bordering 3 different species, this was very difficult to actually punch through, at least by force. However, neither of the aggressive species were stupid enough to try it. You didn't want to bring in and end up fighting 2 different wars at the same time. Even an aggressive species as the Forced realized how stupid it was to fight a war on multiple fronts. However, for our enhanced humans and their families, this was not the immediate concern. Their immediate concern was the fact that the Academy was closing down until the war was over. The reasons for this were multifaceted. For one, the Academy was only 2 jumps away from the front lines, 2 sectors. So if there was going to be any type of incursion, the Academy may or may not be hit. And of course, the parents did not want to leave their young ones to be slaughtered, even by accident, by a ship that was out of control. They wanted to remove them. Also, fights were breaking out every single day. It didn't matter what species. Of course, the Nishani and Forced were at each other's throats. But they would get on the Vunshin's face, or the Zegneko, even the Ko. They wanted to make sure that each side was actually choosing a side, or making sure they stayed neutral. If the ones who were not fighting had any type of opinion, aside from, we're backing out of this, we don't have an opinion, there was immediately a fight. And this caused many, many issues. Not the least of which was the fact that the teachers couldn't patrol enough. Cindy would literally drop in as she decided to fly around to watch. Her presence was enough, even though she wasn't a warrior by any stretch of the imagination as far as training-wise. She was human, and that was enough to scare most sides to just calm the hell down. However, fights were breaking out so much that keeping the peace was simply a losing battle. Gretnar, when she heard about that Larry was going to lose his job, at least put on sabbatical or whatever, she wondered where they could go. Larry and Vince sat down and had to talk about relocation. They couldn't go into Forced space. They couldn't go into Nishani space. They didn't want to impose on any other species. That would just be rude, if nothing else. Plus, neither species wanted to bring even the chance of war into their borders. And, of course, neither men could ever think of going against that logic. So they had to ask their local spook. They simply asked, "Hey, Spooky, you got any locations for us? Preferably something in human space." The one that used to have the title of Handler would handle this situation. He told them there was a colony world that was going to be set up specifically for this reason. Both of the men were confused at this. So quick? Oh, yeah, we don't screw around, he would say. With that, Larry and Vince wouldn't put too much stock in this as they realized that somebody was going 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. But because of that, their families wouldn't be stuck on the ships. They did not want that to happen. Kids on the ships get bored extremely quick and tend to break things. And when you're dealing with high technology like that, you don't want kids to go around breaking things. It's just that simple. Even though they don't want to break things, they're gonna. Ask any parent. Eventually, they were able to get aboard their ships and they headed for Sigma 957. This was a simple colony world, a green world, of course, and had the potential to be an agro world, but was going to take a lot of work. It had been recently terraformed with human technology and was only close to Co territory, only about one sector away from their border. This was fine. The Co were a very peaceful species and had never shown any aggression to anybody. They simply wanted to be left alone. And that was fine by all humans because that's the way they were seeing it as well. With that, they will meet Greknar's sister when they get there, as she turned out to be a refugee as well. In transit, both sides found out about the fact that both the Nishani and the forced governments were getting a little pissed off at the outcome of the battle. And because of that, they were trying to place the blame on others that had nothing to do with it. A common political tactic. But this meant that Gretnar and Femkest were both going to be prosecuted. Or, if nothing else, persecuted. As it turns out, inside each government, they were going to be pushing the fault or loss of the battle itself on altered personnel. This was confusing since they tried to keep altered personnel out of the fight. But no, they said that any of those who were altered were somehow the reason why they lost. The internal struggle meant that eventually there would be concentration zones for those who'd been altered. The humans offered to take the altered ones off their hands. However, this was meant at first with silence, and eventually, the humans were allowed to send a transport ship to pick them up. Surprisingly, they weren't that many, maybe 5 to 10,000 on each side, which truly wasn't a lot considering the tens of billions of personnel that they had to pull from. The Nishani and the Forced covered many, many sectors. And, well, they like to breed. Well, who doesn't? Larry and Vince were discussing some of the reports, and they found out that the Nishani who were pushed into the zones and were going to be relocated had originally offered little resistance. The Nishani are not an aggressive people, and they simply went along with what the government told them to. The Forced, on the other hand, fought back, and there was heavy resistance and a lot of losses. This was not surprising at all, considering how they are. However, it was still the matter that they had been torn from their families and lost contact with them. In fact, this is what was driving Femkest and Gretnir so crazy, is they couldn't contact any of their families. At least, Gretnar would have her sister nearby. At least, she hoped so, but they gotta land on the planet first and verify. Femkest, on the other hand, was a wreck at the idea and would hold her kids to every chance she got. She wanted to hold on to them and hold them tight. Eventually, they would try to squirm away, as all kids do, and Vince would have to go over and basically be the hug doll. However, the fact that she'd been altered, well, Vince would say, "She's breaking my ribs, man! She's breaking my ribs!" About halfway to the new world, Larry and Vince sat the ladies down and told them something that happened in human history. This was known as the schism, and the reason they can't go back to Earth. You see, back in the day when all the alterations was happening, as he motioned to himself, there was originally an acceptance of it. But then there were those that either couldn't be changed or didn't want to be changed, but they also wanted to control everybody else, whether they should or shouldn't, and all this other junk. It's the typical somebody wants to live your life and thinks they can do it better than you can BS. And honestly, most of us just want to be left the head alone, and they just didn't understand that. Yeah, it was horrible for a while there. They just kind of went at us. I mean, you can't really tell from us. You really can't tell from us. But we've both been changed just enough where we're not considered full blood humans anymore. The girls seemed a bit put back at this, and then the realization started to enter their minds and their eyes got really big. Yeah, it's only true humans can be on Earth. I can't go back. I'm not allowed to go back. They'd shoot this ship down if I tried to go back. Both of the ladies looked confused, looked at the ship, realized how strong it was, and then realized how nonchalantly the men were talking about how quickly a ship like this would be destroyed. Yeah, they would take both of us out pretty quick if we tried that shit. But we can actually enter human territory. That's why we had to talk to our government spirit, so to speak. The girls were more confused, but they understood the reference. Larry tried to lay it out. You see, ladies, when it all happened, there was a massive loss of life. The fact that it's really hard to kill an altered person like us made it a lot easier for us to actually stay in the fight, but we didn't want the fight to happen anyway. We just wanted to be living in peace. And after bodies ended up being stacked up, it was horrible, just terrible. He looked over a little bit at Vince, and Vince was just had his head and shaking it in the no fashion. He didn't want to remember this time in human history. It was bad. It was just bad. Just we'll leave it at that. But because of that, eventually we came to a agreement. Why bloodshed so much? I still don't understand. I swear that's just part of us being human, but it's something about being human I still don't get. Even with all the blood I've shed, believe me, if you could see it, my hands would be dripping. The girls were a little confused at the reference. They thought maybe they'd just butchered something, but Larry continued. You see, eventually we came up with an accord. We would leave Earth itself with the natural humans. Nobody would be allowed to alter. You couldn't alter the fauna, you couldn't alter the flora, you couldn't alter anything. It had to be 100% natural. Anything that was altered there was immediately destroyed and replaced by something that was natural. Now, this would take a long, long time, but we found out that screwing with the genetic codes of a lot of the plants and animals was causing a lot of problems, and I cannot stress how many problems that was causing. So, to shorten the amount of people they needed to feed, and of course remove folks, they paid us off with these. He motioned with his hands up. The ladies realized he was talking about the ships themselves. Now, don't get me wrong, these ships are wonderful. And at the time, we had to make sure they were state of the art. They tried to play us on that. Something as simple as the sensor readouts. I still remember having the conversation. The guy was trying to give me a Mark III. I said, state of the art is Mark 16. Stop trying to play me. You try to play me one more time, and I'm going to use my enhanced hands to snap your neck. So stop being a dick. With that, the engineers stopped playing the games and realized that we weren't going to just go easy. Along with that, we had to make sure that our CNI worked and we could actually make sure we purged the entire system and we reinstituted it with our own. I actually had to scan the brain of 3 different people to make Aya my AI right here. Along with that, I had to actually scan my own brain. That's how we got the chief over there. The girls looked over and saw the armored robot still standing there like a statue. Though, of course, we can go back into human territory for 1 or 2 reasons. Into the territory, not to Earth, I gotta say that correctly. We can go back for enhancements. I can bring this ship in and it can be completely redone. I mean, completely redone with the latest weapons, the latest sensors, the latest everything. In fact, this sucker was upgraded right before I went to school. The girls all of a sudden got their eyes really wide, and Greknar's tail shot straight up in the air, and they realized that the ship itself was only about 10 years old. As far as ship designs, that's fresh off the lot. Vince jumped in. Yeah, but this may be a great ship. We may be able to kick some serious ass with it. And we may be able to live off this thing permanently. But there's a trade off. We can't go back to our homeworld. We'll never actually land on it. We can fly by it once, maybe every century or two. But that's it. And I'll tell you what, that's one of the reasons we tried to talk you out of the enhancements. We didn't want you to have to go through the same struggles we did. We tried. We tried to talk you out of it, but, I mean, you ladies wanted this. The girls looked at each other, looked each other up and down, and then Femcast said, Then you wouldn't have find us nearly as attractive, would you? As she arched her body so that she emphasized her bust. Well, yeah, you kind of got us on that one, as the guys looked at each other and laughed. As they got ready to land on their new world, they looked out to see what type of planet it was. It was a massive rock. Though it was green mostly, you could see large strips of water going across. This was strange. They wondered if it was actually ocean or is covered in fresh water. If it was one or the other, there might be some issues. Along with that, even though it was a much larger planet, which meant the gravity was going to be higher, there was also rings, dense rings, similar to that of Saturn. Although, unlike Saturn, this one had 151 moons and not 140 plus. This made things very, very interesting. Larry and Vince decided to park their ships right next to one of the largest moons and simply have it sitting there. They would stay cloaked if at all possible, but they would stay about equidistant and make sure they only moved if they absolutely had to. Though as long as there was no enemy in the area, they would decloak and send out a signal to the other ships so they wouldn't accidentally bump into each other. The cloaking field was very good. So good, in fact, that most other human ships couldn't even pick up each other. As Vince would put it, they're stealth rigged. Though this made exiting the ship very difficult. The corvettes that left had to actually clear the gravity well of the moon they were orbiting. However, this was not so difficult. It did jerk them all to the side a little bit, but aside from momentary discomfort, they all headed towards the planet and towards the landing zone. After landing on the planet and exiting, they were surprised. They saw Greknar's sister standing there, her blonde hair flowing in the breeze and that sheer sundress she was wearing floating away as well. Later on, they would ask her, why in the hell did she even wear a sheer sundress? I mean, they could see pretty much right through it. It makes me feel good, as she would say, always tilting herself and kind of moving herself to accentuate her curves. With this, both of the guys would look at each other and try desperately not to go, ugh, this is going to be bad. Both families eventually got upon a ground transport and followed Greknar's sister all the way to where their new houses would be. They were surprised. Both houses were already set up. In fact, they were linked up together, land-wise, right next to each other. Along with that, they were linked up with Greknar's sister as well. And they would know that there was another one just in case, and they knew who would be there. Each one came with the house itself, which was outfitted, of course, with a garage, basement, all the amenities, to include a bunker, just in case, and was sitting on a little over 21 hectares of land. This would give them enough area to work with so they could actually enhance the land itself. Fabrication equipment was given, along with one tractor each, though they would have to share the plows, harrows, planters, and things of that nature. Along with that, each of them got drums full of non-GMO seeds. They had to check to make sure they were heirloom, and once they all checked out and make sure they weren't given GMO crap, they were content with this. This would make it good. The kids, however, were not happy, and most understand why. Though they didn't have to share rooms, as each of these houses was a 5-bedroom, 3.5 bathroom, it just didn't suit them. They didn't want to move. I mean, what kid does want to uproot from all their friends and such was that way? It was the typical move. The saving grace, surprisingly, was the fact that they didn't have to share rooms, and each of Femcast's kids didn't have to share with each other. Since she had 3 kids, usually 2 were together, but now with their own room, they were actually content. Once the kids calmed down, all the adults looked and saw this is set up nicely. They moved their shuttles to be a little closer, right on the edge of the property, so if they had to get on the shuttles quick, they could. To their absolute shock, this was thought as well. There was actual landing pads, elevated landing pads, so they could land without destroying the surrounding crops. They were absolutely amazed. Well, more amazing was the fact that Cindy finally showed up. She had actually vacated the academy, but being an enhanced personnel herself, she couldn't go back to Earth. She decided to join them. But this time, she wouldn't take a ground transport. No, she actually flew in on her wings, surprising everybody as she landed. Greknard's sister was there, and combined, they all had over 200 acres. The problem they had was what the hell were they going to do for meat? They had plenty of things they had to actually grow crops, but they needed a protein source. Eventually, they would figure this out. Though life on this planet turned out to be not so easy. I mean, it's hard work farming. Doesn't matter what tech level you're at, it's always hard work farming. They made the best of it, able to acquire some chickens and some simple livestock goats, sheep, pigs if they wanted it, and of course cattle if they wanted. This was easy to deal with considering they had enough property, but they didn't have enough to actually bring in whole giant herds. No, they would need even more acreage, as they needed a lot of it simply to grow hay to feed said animals. This made sure that everything was done systematic. To their absolute delight, the weather on this planet was extremely predictable. There was wet seasons that would happen every 5 months. Well, 4.5 actually, but everyone simply says 5. With that, you would get about 2 weeks of nothing but downpours. After that, everything would clear up, and it would be bright and sunny every single day. There would be the occasional rain shower, but the fact that the ground was so saturated at that point, as long as you had everything planted, everything would just launch out of the ground and grow like crazy. Of course, they need to irrigate every once in a while, but it is what it is, and it was a good way of setting things up. More and more refugees continue to land on the planet, the last of those taken from Nishani forced space. Those that had been altered for any others, like the Co, simply removed their people from the area. It wasn't difficult to do. With more and more folks showing up, it was interesting. Small communities became the thing once again. They had their time going to church. They had their time to socialize once a week with everybody down at the community center. It was crazy. But every time more and more refugees came in, they brought in more reports from the front lines. It was not exactly good news. The war itself had gone into a stalemate. Though there had been multiple skirmishes, nothing the size of the main battle that had started everything off, but no one was gaining any land, any territory. If they tried to actually land anyone on a planet, there would be some sort of raiding party to stop them. Anything from orbital bombardment to an actual simple strafing run. Not to mention the fact that all the planets rotate, which meant eventually the planet itself would rotate around the star itself and end up directly inside enemy controlled territory. This meant that no one was able to do anything. They couldn't hold any planets. And both fleets just kind of stared at each other at that point. The majority of forces were stuck on the front lines, which means there was no way of getting around and doing too much else. Other species, since they weren't allowing military to go through, were just holding the lines where they were. Though commerce still flowed surprisingly well through the area. Neither side wanted to stop any of the other species from trading with each other. The idea of a pirate raid or black marketing was almost unheard of. With the amount of military around, no one even tried to steal a ship from a spaceport. They would immediately find themselves under the barrel of a weapon, and usually not a friendly one. The worst that ever happened in anybody's territory was small raids that just somehow managed to get through. It was enough to scare folks, but not really enough to cause any true damage. Surprisingly, something came out of all this. The Vunshin were trying to become the mediator. Everybody should have seen this coming, considering they are the third species that borders the contested zone. However, their border with the contested zone is rather small compared to the other two. Their fleet was built up but wasn't moving. It was more defensive than anything else. However, on both sides, with the Nishani and the Forged, there were high amounts of Celtipsian ships sent towards the front. The Celtipsians themselves seemed to not want to build up any of their own fleets, but they were more than happy to sell all sorts of weapons to both sides. It was very, very sneaky. One of the other things to come out of the reports was the fact that Greknar's father had been crippled in the initial fight. Not killed, which was the only reason that Greknar didn't break down into tears right in front of her children. However, the fact that he had altered himself to be a bit stronger, faster, even though his exterior was pretty much unaltered completely, he just looked bigger and meaner than he did before. His government was giving him minimal care. Thankfully for him, he was able to get more care from Greknar's mother. She was 100% unaltered. She didn't want to be. And since she was caring for her father, the father was going to be fine. Although, as Larry put it, yeah, that guy's a bit of a badass. He'll be fine. Though not everything was fine. Both sides, both Greknar and Femcast, had found out that several of the cousins they knew were no longer breathing. Hell, they were atomized, many of them, inside the fight itself. It got bad. It got very bad. And both of them, on several occasions, had to leave the room as they were definitely starting to break down. Sad that they wouldn't be able to even say goodbye. In many of the cultures, this is a very, very big deal. Femcast could only take any type of comfort in knowing that even though both of her parents were military members, they were both advisors, administrators, that sort of thing. So they would be kept far away from the front lines. So the chances of them being injured or killed was very, very low. This didn't help Greknar any. But Greknar was from a proud race, of course, and she did not want anyone to see her break down. However, as she sat there, on either side, her kids came up and gave her a hug. She held on to him very, very close as they had realized that she was just on the verge of breaking down. But being held by her kids, that kept them together. Over the next year and a half plus, Larry and Vince fell into the life of a farmer. They would sell their crops for equipment and expand the houses as best they could. The kids would help where they can, but kids are only so strong, and lifting bales that weigh 65, 70 pounds can be difficult for someone who's only around 10 years old. However, they were learning as much as they could about the equipment, how to fix it, how to operate everything. Though they were still watched over by their parents, it turned out that the farm life was suiting them just fine. The only real scares they had was when Sherry almost got her tail caught in the combine because she didn't realize how long her tail is. Since it is long, even for a forced, she didn't realize it was that far out. It did get clipped and she did cry and scream for a while, but she didn't lose any part of it. With that, all the kids were shown how dangerous the equipment can be and they had to put in rules. In particular, both Sherry and John had to wrap their tails around themselves and just make sure that they weren't ever letting them go around the equipment. Along with that, some of the animals would nip at them if they weren't wrapped around. With that, also, there was the rule that, well, Femcast's kids had to really watch it because for some reason the animals just liked to lick them. Maybe it's the taste of a Nishani? Nobody figured it out. Maybe they sweat some sort of salt, nobody knows, but it seems like the animals were just drawn, and they were worried that something like maybe a horse would come up lick and try to take a bite out of them. Though the kids found all this funny, the adults understood how dangerous this actually could be. Enhanced or not, they didn't want to see their kids get hurt. Nobody did. Femcast and Greknar fell into the cast of simple housewives, and they seemed to enjoy it. They could spend most of their time just making a couple of meals, cleaning up a little bit of messes. The kids would go out and play, and they could sit there and relax for most of the day. It was peaceful. You wouldn't think out in the stars there's people desperately trying to kill each other. Over what? Trying to mine some area? Over some simple territory? You wouldn't think from the look of that just calm village that there was a war raging out there, with two sides trying everything they can to exterminate the other. But at that time, Larry and Vince were sitting there talking about it, looking at the fact that they were now farming, raising livestock, and things of that nature. They simply would look at each other, and Vince would ask, "Isn't this always what happens?" And Larry would respond, "Yeah, history doesn't repeat. It sure does rhyme a lot, doesn't it?" And with this phrase, they both would turn and look over the fields and remember.